I never wanted to be the villain in someone else's story. But when you own a 40-acre property with a pristine natural lake, and your neighbors decide they don't like the way the sunlight reflects off the water, you learn that sometimes conflict finds you whether you want it or not. My name is Marcus Webb, and this is the story of how my homeowners association tried to poison my lake, nearly destroyed their own water supply, and learned a very expensive lesson about property rights and hydrogeology. It started 6 years ago when I inherited the property from my grandfather, Henry Webb, a quiet man and retired civil engineer, who'd bought this land back in 1978 when property in rural Colorado was still affordable. He'd spent 30 years turning it into his personal paradise, clearing trails, planting native trees, and most importantly, maintaining the health of Mirror Lake, which wasn't much by resort standards but covered maybe 8 acres at its fullest. Fed by an underground spring and seasonal runoff from the mountains, the water was crystal clear, cold enough to make you gasp even in July, and home to a healthy population of rainbow trout that Grandpa Henry had carefully introduced and managed over the decades. He'd built a small cabin on the eastern shore with solar panels on the roof, and a gravity-fed water system from a spring higher up the mountain, creating an off-grid paradise that represented everything he valued about self-sufficiency and environmental stewardship. When I first inherited the property at age 32, I was burned out from a decade of working as an environmental consultant in Denver, and the timing felt like fate, so I quit my job, sold my condo, and moved into Grandpa Henry's cabin full-time, much to my parents' concern and my ex-girlfriend's bewilderment. Sitting on the porch of that cabin and watching the mist rise off Mirror Lake at dawn, I'd never felt more at peace, a tranquility that lasted exactly 14 months before everything changed. The trouble began when Pinnacle Ridge Estates broke ground 2 miles down the valley, a luxury subdivision promising mountain living with modern amenities to wealthy retirees and Denver executives looking for weekend retreats. I'd heard rumors about the development but didn't pay much attention at first, figuring that 2 miles was enough distance to maintain my solitude and privacy. The development was ambitious, featuring 50 custom home lots, each minimum 2 acres, with promises of hiking trails, a community center, and what they're marketing, materials called sustainable mountain architecture. What those marketing materials didn't mention was that the developers had severely underestimated the complexity of bringing water to a high-altitude subdivision built on rocky, poorly permeable soil. The county required them to provide culinary water service, but connecting to the municipal system would have cost millions due to the distance and elevation gain. So the developers had drilled wells, expensive deep wells that produced water but not enough water to support 50 luxury homes with their lawns, hot tubs, and expectations of unlimited supply. That's when someone at Pinnacle Ridge Estates discovered something interesting on their geological surveys. Mirror Lake sat at a higher elevation than their development, and the underground aquifer that fed my lake appeared to flow downhill through fractured bedrock, eventually feeding into the same water table their wells were drawing from. In their minds, my lake wasn't just a scenic feature on someone else's property, it was their water reservoir and they wanted access to it. The first contact came in the form of a friendly letter from someone named Bradley Hutchinson, who identified himself as the president of the Pinnacle Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. The letter was professionally printed on heavy cream-colored paper with embossed letterhead, and it explained that they were reaching out to neighboring property owners to foster community relations and discuss matters of mutual interest. Bradley invited me to attend their next HOA meeting as a guest to explore potential partnership opportunities regarding shared natural resources. I remember reading that letter 3 times, trying to figure out what it really meant, because in my experience, HOS didn't send fancy invitations to people who weren't even in their jurisdiction unless they wanted something specific. I decided to attend the meeting out of curiosity, driving down to the Pinnacle Ridge Estates Community Center on a Thursday evening in September, finding myself in a room full of well-dressed retirees who looked at my hiking boots and flannel shirt like I'd wandered in from a different century. Bradley Hutchinson turned out to be exactly what I expected: mid-skit silver hair, expensive watch, and the kind of confident smile that comes from a lifetime of getting what he wants. He welcomed me warmly, introduced me to several HOA board members, and then launched into a presentation about water security challenges facing the community. The presentation included graphs, charts, and expert testimony from their all building toward one central point. Mirror Lake was connected to their aquifer, and they wanted to establish a formal water sharing agreement. Bradley's proposal was dressed up in language about neighboring cooperation and responsible resource management. But the bottom line was simple. They wanted to run a pipeline from my lake to supplement their well system, and in exchange, they'd offer me a generous annual compensation of $5,000, plus the privilege of becoming an associate member of their HOA, which would give me access to their community center and hiking trails. I sat there listening to this proposal, watching their hydrogeologists point to maps and cross-sections, and felt a growing sense of disbelief that these people thought I would voluntarily give up control of my grandfather's lake for what amounted to pocket change and a gym membership. When Bradley finished his presentation and asked for my thoughts, I kept my response simple and polite, explaining that I appreciated their situation but wasn't interested in any agreement that would give them access to or control over my water resources. The room went quiet, and I could see the confusion on their faces, as if they couldn't comprehend why anyone would turn down their generous offer. Bradley maintained his smile, but I noticed it had hardened around the edges, and he suggested we table the discussion and revisit it after I'd had time to consider the benefits more carefully, which I understood to mean they weren't accepting my answer as final. Over the next few months, the letters kept coming, each one slightly less friendly than the last, progressing from partnership opportunities to veiled warnings about being a good neighbor and community responsibility. Bradley visited my property twice, showing up unannounced with different board members, trying new angles and arguments, even increasing their offer to $10,000 annually, then $15,000, amounts that might have seemed significant to them but were insulting, compared to the value of maintaining control over my own water supply. I remained firm in my refusals, and eventually, the visits stopped, which should have been a relief but instead made me uneasy because I knew people like Bradley didn't just give up when they wanted something badly enough. The first sign of trouble came on a cold morning in March when I noticed the water in Mirror Lake looked different, slightly cloudy near the southern end, where it had always been crystal clear. I walked down to investigate and found a faint chemical smell in the air, nothing overpowering but definitely not natural, reminiscent of chlorine or some kind of industrial cleaner. I spent the morning taking water samples and testing pH levels, finding slight anomalies but nothing dramatic enough to explain the cloudiness or smell. Over the next week, I monitored the lake obsessively, watching as the cloudiness spread and intensified, and several of my trout started showing signs of stress, swimming erratically near the surface and gathering near the inlet where fresh water entered from the spring. I collected more samples and sent them to a lab in Denver, paying extra for rush processing because I had a sinking feeling about what was happening, and when the results came back, they confirmed my worst suspicions. The water contained elevated levels of copper sulfate and several algicides commonly used in lake management, chemicals that hadn't been in my lake the month before and certainly hadn't appeared there naturally. Someone was poisoning my lake, and I had a pretty good idea who. I drove down to Pinnacle Ridge Estates that same afternoon, furious but trying to maintain composure, and demanded a meeting with Bradley Hutchinson and the HOA board. The community manager initially tried to put me off, saying the board was busy and I'd need to schedule an appointment, but I made it clear I wasn't leaving until someone explained why chemicals were showing up in my lake water. After an hour of waiting in the community center lobby, Bradley finally appeared with two other board members, Susan Chen and Robert Martinez, and they agreed to speak with me in a conference room. I laid out my evidence, showing them the lab results and water quality data, explaining that someone had deliberately introduced chemicals into my lake and that I knew they had both motive and opportunity given their ongoing interest in my water supply. Bradley's response was a masterclass in manufactured innocence, his face showing carefully calibrated surprise as he insisted they knew nothing about any chemicals and suggested perhaps I had inadvertently contaminated my own lake or agricultural runoff from other properties might be responsible. Susan Chen, who served as the HOA treasurer, suggested that water quality can naturally fluctuate and that I shouldn't jump to conclusions without concrete proof of wrongdoing. Robert Martinez, their vice president, added that making accusations against the HOA without evidence could be considered defamatory and that I should be careful about spreading rumors that could damage their community's reputation. Their denials were too smooth, too coordinated, and the implied legal threat only confirmed my suspicions that they were involved. But I didn't have direct proof of who had accessed my property or how the chemicals had been introduced. I left that meeting knowing I was dealing with people who would lie to my face and threaten legal action to cover their tracks, and I realized I needed to approach this situation more strategically. I installed trail cameras around the perimeter of my property, focusing on access points near the lake. And I contacted an attorney in Boulder who specialized in water rights and property law. My attorney, Patricia Morgan, was a sharp woman in her 50s who'd built her reputation defending rural landowners against development pressure. And when I explained my situation, she listened carefully and then told me something that made my blood run cold. If the contamination in my lake could be traced to negligence or malicious action by the HOA, they could face both civil and criminal liability. But proving it would require catching them in the act, or finding documented evidence of their involvement. She also reminded me that under Colorado water law, my lake and its underground sources were part of my property rights, and any interference with those resources could constitute both trespass and water rights violation, which carried serious legal consequences. Armed with cameras and legal counsel, I began my surveillance, checking the footage every morning and maintaining detailed logs of the lake's condition. For 2 weeks, nothing happened, and I started to wonder if the HOA had gotten spooked by my confrontation and backed off. But then on a Tuesday night in late March, my cameras captured something remarkable. 2 men in dark clothing approaching the lake from the southern boundary around 2 a.m., carrying what appeared to be heavy containers, and spending roughly 20 minutes at the water's edge before retreating the way they'd come. The footage was dark and grainy, shot in infrared, but I could make out enough details to confirm this was deliberate sabotage, though I couldn't identify the men clearly enough for legal purposes. I immediately called Patricia, who instructed me to secure the footage and file a police report, which I did the next morning, meeting with a deputy sheriff who seemed skeptical about the whole situation but agreed to document my complaint and the video evidence. The deputy's skepticism dissolved somewhat when I showed him the water quality data and explained the timeline of events, and he said he'd follow up with the though he warned me that, without clear identification of the perpetrators or direct evidence linking them to Pinnacle Ridge Estates, prosecution would be difficult. I also sent copies of the footage to Bradley Hutchinson via certified mail, along with a formal cease and desist letter from Patricia, demanding that the HOA immediately stop any and all interference with my property and water resources, and warning that continued violations would result in both civil litigation and criminal complaints. The response came faster than expected, though not from Bradley but from the HOA's legal counsel, a firm out of Denver that specialized in real estate and municipal law. Their letter was aggressive, denying any involvement in the alleged contamination, accusing me of making false accusations to extort money from the HOA, and threatening a defamation lawsuit if I continued to spread what they called malicious lies about their community. The letter also included an interesting twist. They claimed to have documentation showing that Mirror Lake's water quality had been declining for years due to my poor management practices, and they suggested I was trying to blame the HOA for problems I'd created myself. This was obviously false, as I had regular water quality tests dating back years showing consistently excellent conditions, but it revealed their legal strategy, which was to attack my credibility and flip the narrative to make me look like the problem. Patricia wasn't intimidated by their threats, and she responded with an even more detailed letter laying out our evidence, the timeline of events, and the legal consequences the HOA would face if the contamination continued, adding that we were prepared to seek both injunctive relief and substantial damages if necessary. For several weeks, an uneasy stalemate settled over the situation, with no new contamination episodes but also no admission of responsibility from the HOA, and I continued my surveillance while working to restore my lake's water quality, through natural filtration and by temporarily diverting the main outlet to flush contaminated water downstream. The trout population had taken a hit, with several dozen fish dying before I caught the problem, but the survivors seemed to be recovering as the water cleared. Then in mid-April, everything escalated in a way no one anticipated. I was working in my cabin one afternoon when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize, and when I answered, a woman's voice asked if I was Marcus Webb and then identified herself as Jennifer Hartley, a resident of Pinnacle Ridge Estates. She sounded nervous, speaking quickly and asking if we could meet somewhere private, because she had information about what the HOA had done to my lake. We agreed to meet at a coffee shop in the nearest town, a neutral location where we wouldn't be seen by her neighbors. And when I arrived, I found Jennifer to be a woman in her early 40s, professionally dressed, looking anxious and glancing around as if afraid of being followed. She explained that she'd moved to Pinnacle Ridge Estates 8 months ago with her husband and 2 children, drawn by the promise of a quiet mountain community, but she'd become increasingly uncomfortable with the HOA's aggressive tactics, and what she called their siege mentality regarding the water situation. Jennifer told me that she'd attended HOA meetings where Bradley Hutchinson had openly discussed dealing with the web problem, and that several board members had talked about ways to encourage me to cooperate, with one member suggesting they could make my lake less appealing if I wouldn't share it voluntarily. She said the discussion had made her uncomfortable even then, but she hadn't realized they would actually act on it until she overheard a conversation between Bradley and Robert Martinez in the community center parking lot a few days ago. According to Jennifer, Bradley had been complaining to Robert that their lake treatment plan had backfired because I'd detected the chemicals too quickly and they hadn't introduced enough to kill the fish population completely, which had apparently been part of their strategy. Based on the theory that if my lake became a dead, contaminated eyesore, I'd be more willing to accept their pipeline proposal as a way to restore the water quality with fresh input from their wells. The cynicism of this plan was breathtaking. The idea that they would deliberately destroy a healthy ecosystem just to gain leverage in a negotiation. But what Jennifer told me next was even more disturbing. She'd also heard them discussing a backup plan, involving complaints to county officials about alleged environmental violations on my property, with the goal of getting enough regulatory pressure applied that I'd be forced to either sell or accept outside management of my water resources. I asked Jennifer why she was telling me all this, risking her relationship with her neighbors and the HOA that essentially controlled her property's value, and she looked me straight in the eye and said she hadn't moved to the mountains to be part of a community that would destroy nature for convenience, that she had children who deserved to grow up understanding right from wrong, and that she couldn't stay silent while watching people act like corporate villains in a place that was supposed to be about preserving natural beauty. I believed her, both because her story aligned with everything else I'd observed, and because the emotion in her voice was genuine. But I also knew that witness testimony alone wouldn't be enough, especially since she hadn't actually seen anyone poisoning the lake and her information was based on overheard conversations that could be denied. Patricia agreed when I called her later, explaining that Jennifer's testimony would be valuable in establishing motive and the HOA's mindset, but we needed harder evidence to build a solid case, preferably documents or recordings that directly proved the HOA's involvement. That's when Jennifer surprised me again by calling the next day to say she'd been thinking about our conversation and had remembered something potentially important. As an HOA board member herself, elected just 2 months ago to fill a vacancy, she had access to the HOA's shared document, drive, and email archives, and while she couldn't remove or delete anything without raising suspicions, she could review materials and flag anything relevant. Patricia cautioned that we needed to be careful about how any information was obtained to ensure it would be admissible in court and wouldn't expose Jennifer to criminal liability for unauthorized access. But Jennifer pointed out that as a board member, she had legitimate access to HOA documents and wasn't doing anything illegal by reviewing materials she was entitled to see. Over the next week, Jennifer conducted her research, searching through months of emails, meeting minutes, and financial records, looking for any evidence connecting the HOA to the lake contamination. What she found exceeded our expectations. A paper trail showing that the HOA had hired a lake management company called Aquaclear Solutions in February, paying them $3,500 for what was described in the invoice as consultation and treatment services for Mirror Lake water quality improvement. The invoice itself wasn't smoking gun-proof, since it could theoretically be defended as a legitimate consulting expense. But Jennifer also found email exchanges between Bradley Hutchinson and the Aquaclear Solutions owner, discussing discrete application methods and ensuring the treatment appears natural and adjusting chemical ratios to accelerate algae bloom without obvious contamination markers. The emails stopped just short of explicitly stating they were poisoning someone else's lake without permission, but the implications were clear enough that any reasonable person reading them would understand what was being planned. Jennifer also discovered meeting minutes from a closed executive session in January where the board had discussed alternative strategies for securing water access from adjacent properties and had authorized Bradley to take necessary steps to demonstrate the benefits of professional lake management to neighboring landowners, which in context appeared to be language for the sabotage plan. Armed with this documentation, which Jennifer provided to Patricia through proper legal channels, including signing an affidavit about how and where she'd obtained it, we now had the evidence we needed to prove the HOA's involvement in contaminating my lake. Patricia filed a comprehensive lawsuit in district court, naming the Pinnacle Ridge Estates HOA, Bradley Hutchinson individually, several other board members, and Aquaclear Solutions as defendants, alleging trespass, property damage, water rights violations, conspiracy, and seeking both compensatory and punitive damages plus an injunction preventing any further interference with my property. The lawsuit laid out the entire timeline, included the water quality data, surveillance footage, Jennifer's testimony, and most devastatingly, the emails and financial records showing the HOA's payment to Aquaclear and their discussions about treating my lake without permission. The local newspaper got wind of the lawsuit within days, running a front-page story about the HOA's alleged poisoning of a neighbor's lake, and suddenly Pinnacle Ridge Estates was dealing with a public relations nightmare as prospective buyers cancelled contracts and current residents began questioning what else their board might be doing without proper disclosure. Bradley Hutchinson and the other defendants hired an aggressive defense firm that immediately went into damage control mode, filing motions to dismiss the case and issuing public statements claiming the lawsuit was frivolous, and that the HOA had merely consulted with a lake management company about water quality issues in the region without ever authorizing or conducting any treatment of my property. Their defense strategy appeared to be denying everything despite the documentary evidence and attacking Jennifer's credibility by suggesting she was a disgruntled board member with personal grudges. But the defense fell apart quickly when Patricia deposed the owner of Aquaclear Solutions, who apparently decided that taking the fall for the HOA wasn't worth potential criminal charges, and he testified under oath that Bradley Hutchinson had specifically hired him to treat Mirror Lake, had provided maps and access information, and had instructed him to use chemicals that would promote algae growth and stress fish populations without causing immediate massive die-offs that would be too obvious. The Aquaclear owner also testified that he'd raised concerns about treating a lake on private property without the owner's permission, but Bradley had assured him that they had an informal agreement with the landowner and that everything was authorized, which was a complete lie. This testimony was devastating to the HOA's defense because it established not only that they'd deliberately contaminated my lake but that they'd done so knowing it was wrong and had lied to their contractor to get him to do it. The case now shifted from whether the contamination happened to how much it would cost the defendants, and Patricia began preparing damage calculations that included water quality restoration costs, fish restocking, property value, and punitive damages for the malicious nature of the conduct. Then in early June, something happened that nobody anticipated and that completely changed the dynamics of the entire situation. Residents of Pinnacle Ridge Estates started complaining about their tap water. At first it was just a few people mentioning that their water tasted strange or looked slightly cloudy. Complaints that the HOA initially dismissed as normal variations in well water quality. But within days, the complaints multiplied and residents began reporting symptoms including nausea, headaches, and stomach problems after drinking their tap water. The HOA sent water samples to a lab for testing, and when the results came back, they revealed elevated levels of copper sulfate and other chemicals, the same chemicals that had been introduced into my lake 3 months earlier. The realization hit everyone at the same time. The contamination hadn't stayed confined to Mirror Lake but had traveled through the underground aquifer system, the same system that connected my lake to the Pinnacle Ridge Estates wells, and now the poison the HOA had deliberately introduced into my water supply had come back to contaminate their own community's drinking water. The irony was almost poetic, except that now dozens of families were dealing with unsafe water and potential health effects, all because the HOA had been so focused on gaining control of my lake that they'd never stopped to consider the hydrological consequences of poisoning an upstream water source. The panic that followed was immediate and intense, with residents flooding HOA meetings demanding answers, hiring their own attorneys to investigate potential health claims, and calling county health officials who immediately issued a do not drink advisory for the entire Pinnacle Ridge Estates community. The HOA had to arrange for emergency water deliveries, bringing in trucks of potable water while they figured out how to address the contamination, and the costs were staggering, easily exceeding $100,000 in the first week alone. Bradley Hutchinson tried to maintain control, issuing statements about unforeseen contamination events and working with experts to resolve the situation, but residents had access to the same local newspaper articles about my lawsuit and quickly connected the dots between the HOA's actions against my lake and their current water crisis. The backlash was swift and brutal, with calls for Bradley's resignation and emergency HOA meetings where angry residents demanded full disclosure of what the board had done and why they'd risked the community's water supply for a pipeline scheme that most residents hadn't even known about. Jennifer Hartley, who'd already been my inside source, became a hero to many residents when she publicly confirmed the board's actions and provided documentation of their contamination plan, and she led a movement to recall the entire HOA board and install new leadership that would prioritize transparency and environmental responsibility over aggressive expansion tactics. The contamination crisis also attracted attention from state environmental officials, who launched an investigation into potential violations of the Colorado Water Quality Control Act, and the county district attorney began reviewing the case for potential criminal charges related to the contamination of both my private property and the community's water supply. Bradley Hutchinson, Robert Martinez, Susan Chen, and two other board members who'd been involved in the contamination plan all hired criminal defense attorneys, and the comfortable retirement they'd envisioned in their mountain community had turned into a nightmare of legal battles, community ostracism, and potential jail time. For my part, I watched these developments with a mixture of vindication and genuine concern, because while I was angry about what they'd done to my lake, I hadn't wanted to see families and children dealing with contaminated water, and I certainly hadn't anticipated that their sabotage would boomerang back on them so completely. Patricia advised me that the contamination of the Pinnacle Ridge Estate's water supply actually strengthened our lawsuit by demonstrating the extent of the damage and the reckless nature of the defendant's conduct, and she suggested we might be able to reach a favorable settlement now that the HOA was dealing with multiple legal and practical crises. The settlement negotiations began in July, with the HOA's insurance company taking the lead, because they were facing potential claims from both me and dozens of residents who'd been exposed to contaminated water. The insurance company's position was that they'd cover certain damages, but were investigating whether to deny coverage entirely based on the intentional nature of the contamination, which would leave the HOA and individual board members personally liable for millions of dollars in potential damages. This threat focused everyone's attention on reaching a settlement quickly before the situation got even worse, and after several rounds of negotiations, we arrived at an agreement that was more comprehensive than I'd originally expected. Under the settlement terms, the Pinnacle Ridge Estates HOA would pay me $380,000 in damages, covering water quality, restoration, lost fish stock, property value, diminution, legal fees, and punitive damages, and they would record a permanent easement protecting Mirror Lake from any future interference, meaning they could never again attempt to access, control, or treat my water sources. The individual board members would also pay an additional $50,000 collectively from their personal funds, money that would go toward environmental monitoring and restoration. More importantly, the settlement required the HOA to implement a comprehensive water quality remediation plan for their own community, working with state environmental officials to clean their contaminated wells and establish new water quality testing protocols, with all costs borne by the HOA and its insurance carrier. The HOA would also have to disclose the contamination incident and settlement to all current and prospective residents, essentially ensuring that buyers would know about the water issues before purchasing property in the development. Bradley Hutchinson, Robert Martinez, and Susan Chen were required to resign from the HOA board immediately, and they were barred from holding any HOA leadership position in the future, effectively ending their influence over the community they'd tried to control. Aquaclear Solutions agreed to a separate settlement with me for $75,000, and accepted responsibility for their role in the contamination, agreeing to never again treat water bodies without documented permission from property owners and to implement new verification procedures before accepting any lake management contracts. On the criminal side, the district attorney ultimately decided not to pursue charges against the individual board members, determining that while their conduct was reckless and harmful, it didn't quite rise to the level of criminal intent required for prosecution under environmental statutes. Though this decision was controversial and disappointed many Pinnacle Ridge residents who felt justice hadn't been fully served, the civil settlement was finalized in September, 6 months after I'd first noticed the contamination, and when the money arrived in my account, I spent most of it exactly as intended, hiring environmental consultants to assess Mirror Lake's recovery, restocking the trout population with healthy fingerlings from a state hatchery, installing better water quality monitoring equipment, and establishing a fund for ongoing testing and maintenance. I used some of the money to upgrade my cabin's infrastructure and to create a small nature education center on my property where local school groups could learn about lake ecology and watershed protection. Turning the negative experience into something positive for the community, the impact on Pinnacle Ridge Estates was longer lasting and more complicated, with the water contamination crisis costing the HOA nearly $800,000 in cleanup, emergency water supplies, testing, and legal fees. Costs that were passed on to residents through a massive special assessment that led several homeowners to put their properties up for sale at significant losses. Property values in the development dropped by an estimated 20 to 30% as the contamination became public knowledge, and the community gained an unfortunate reputation as the place where the HOA poisoned their own water supply, a stigma that persisted for years. The new HOA board, elected in a recall vote that saw unprecedented turnout, took a completely different approach to governance, emphasizing transparency, environmental stewardship, and cooperation with neighbors rather than aggressive tactics and control. They reached out to me to formally apologize for the previous board's actions and to establish better communication channels. And while I remained cautious, I appreciated the gesture and agreed to meet with them to discuss water issues from a scientific rather than adversarial perspective. One of the new board members was actually a retired hydrologist who'd been appalled by the contamination scheme, and he helped the community understand the interconnected nature of their water system and why protecting upstream resources like my lake was actually in their own best interest, rather than something to be conquered or controlled. Over time, the relationship between my property and Pinnacle Ridge Estates evolved into something resembling actual neighboring cooperation, with the HOA respecting my boundaries and water rights while I occasionally shared information about water quality trends and aquifer conditions that helped them manage their own resources more effectively. Jennifer Hartley remained in the community and became one of the most respected voices in the new HOA, known for her courage in speaking out against corruption and her commitment to environmental values. And she later told me that while the crisis had been stressful and had cost her some friendships with people loyal to the old board, she felt proud of standing up for what was right and that her children had learned important lessons about integrity and consequences. The incident also had broader implications beyond our immediate situation, becoming something of a cautionary tale in Colorado's property law community about the dangers of HOAs overreaching their authority and the importance of understanding water systems before taking action. Patricia Morgan, my attorney, gave several presentations about the case at legal conferences, using it to illustrate principles of water rights, property law, and fiduciary duty, and she told me that several other attorneys had contacted her about similar situations where HOAs or developers were trying to gain control of water resources on adjacent private properties through pressure or manipulation. The case was cited in several subsequent lawsuits and even influenced proposed state legislation about HOA transparency and accountability in water resource management, contributing to reforms that gave property owners better protection against overreaching community associations. As for me, I continued living on my grandfather's property, maintaining Mirror Lake and enjoying the peace that I'd sought when I first moved there, though now with a much deeper appreciation for the legal and hydrological complexities that come with owning significant water resources in an area facing development pressure. The lake recovered fully from the contamination over the course of about 18 months, with water quality returning to pre-incident levels and the trout population rebounding nicely, and I even added some new species to the ecosystem, including a population of native amphibians that helped create more biodiversity. I installed interpretive signs around the lake explaining its ecology and the importance of watershed protection, and I opened the property to occasional educational tours for school groups and environmental organizations, figuring that teaching people about natural water systems might prevent future incidents of ignorance and greed leading to environmental harm. I also maintained the trail cameras and water quality monitoring equipment as a permanent installation, not out of paranoia but out of recognition that vigilance is part of responsible stewardship. When you control resources that others might want, the experience changed my perspective on conflict and community in some fundamental ways, teaching me that sometimes standing firm on principle is the right choice even when it leads to confrontation, and that environmental protection often requires legal protection as well. I learned that not everyone shares the same values about nature and property rights, and that some people will view a pristine lake primarily as an economic resource to be exploited, rather than an ecosystem to be preserved. But I also learned that most people when confronted with the consequences of environmental harm, will choose responsibility over continued damage. The residents of Pinnacle Ridge Estates, aside from the corrupted board members, turned out to be decent people who'd simply trusted the wrong leaders and who felt genuinely remorseful once they understood what had been done in their name, and many of them became advocates for better environmental practices in their own right. The incident also strengthened my resolve to protect not just my own property but the broader watershed that my lake was part of, leading me to work with conservation organizations on easements and protections for other parcels in the valley that might face some similar development pressure. Several years after the settlement, I was contacted by a documentary filmmaker who wanted to make a short film about the case for an environmental series about water rights conflicts in the American West, and after some consideration, I agreed to participate. Figuring that the story had educational value beyond my personal experience, the documentary, titled Poisoning the Well, aired on a public television station and told the story from multiple perspectives, including interviews with me, Jennifer Hartley, several affected residents, hydrologists explaining the aquifer connections, and even a reluctant interview with Bradley Hutchinson, who'd aged considerably in the years since the incident, and who offered a half-hearted apology that felt more about rehabilitation of his image than genuine remorse. The film was well received and won some regional awards, and I heard from several viewers who said it had changed their understanding of HOA governance and water issues, which felt like a positive outcome from an otherwise negative experience. Looking back on the entire saga, from the first suspicious cloudiness in my lake to the eventual settlement and recovery, the thing that struck me most was how easily the disaster could have been avoided if the HOA had simply respected property boundaries and water rights from the beginning. Their water shortage was a real problem that deserved serious solutions, but poisoning a neighbor's lake was never a solution, just a crime, and the fact that they thought they could get away with it revealed a dangerous combination of arrogance and ignorance about both law and hydrology. The contamination of their own water supply was a form of natural justice, the universe's way of demonstrating that environmental systems don't respect human boundaries or intentions, and that poison introduced into a watershed will flow according to geological reality rather than political desire. If there's a lesson in this story beyond the obvious one about not poisoning your neighbor's lake, it's that water connects us all in ways we don't always recognize until something goes wrong, and that protecting water quality isn't just an individual responsibility but a collective necessity that requires cooperation and respect rather than conflict and control. The 40 acres and Mirror Lake that my grandfather left me weren't just property or resources, but part of a larger system that included the aquifer flowing beneath us, the springs feeding into it from above, the wells drawing from it below, and all the lives, human and otherwise, that depended on that water remaining clean and healthy. The HOA learned that lesson the hard way, through contaminated taps and massive legal bills and destroyed reputations, but at least they learned it, and the community that emerged from the crisis was stronger and more environmentally conscious than the one that had tried to poison my lake. As for my lake itself, Mirror Lake continues to live up to its name, reflecting the mountains and sky with crystal clarity, home to thriving populations of trout and frogs and insects, fed by cold underground springs that flow according to ancient geological patterns that predated human settlement and will continue long after we're gone. A reminder that some things are more important than property disputes or HOA politics. That some places deserve protection not because of what they can provide us, but because of what they are in themselves. Ecosystems with intrinsic value that we're privileged to steward for whatever brief time we have the responsibility. I still sit on my cabin porch in the early mornings, watching mist rise off the water, listening to the sounds of birds and breeze through pine trees, and I feel grateful not just for the peace and beauty, but for the lessons learned through conflict. For the reminder that protecting what matters requires vigilance and courage and sometimes the willingness to stand alone against pressure and manipulation, and that doing the right thing doesn't always lead to immediate reward but ultimately creates the kind of world worth living in, where lakes stay clean and neighbors respect boundaries and communities learn from mistakes rather than repeating them, where the law protects stewardship and environmental values triumph over greed and short-sighted ambition, and where a lake can remain what it was meant to be. A mirror reflecting not just mountains and sky but the best of what humanity can achieve, when we choose preservation over exploitation, cooperation over conflict, and long-term wisdom over short-term gain. The end.